"I have a complaint to make," Sir Henry Clithering said, his voice light but carrying an undeniable weight as he scanned the room, his eyes twinkling. He paused just long enough for his audience to stir with curiosity. All eyes turned to him. Colonel Bantry, his legs stretched out in his chair, stared intently at the mantelpiece as though trying to decipher some hidden message. Mrs. Bantry, with an ever-distracted air, surreptitiously flipped through a bulb catalogue that had arrived with the late post. Dr. Lloyd, lost in thought, gazed at Jane Hellyer with open admiration, while Jane herself seemed utterly absorbed in the delicate perfection of her pink polished nails. The only one unmoved by the quiet chaos of the room was Miss Marple, who sat bolt upright, her faded blue eyes locking onto Sir Henry's with a knowing glimmer. "A complaint?" Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft yet sharp with the promise of a clever remark. Sir Henry leaned in slightly, raising his voice just enough for all to hear. "A very serious complaint," he declared. "We are a company of 6, 3 men, 3 women, and I protest on behalf of the downtrodden males. Tonight, 3 stories have been told, and all of them by the men. Where, I ask, are the tales from the ladies? I protest that the women have not done their fair share." Mrs. Bantry bristled with indignation. "Oh, I'm sure we have," she replied. "We've listened with the utmost intelligence, displayed the true womanly attitude, content to sit back and let others shine." Sir Henry chuckled, a warm, knowing laugh. "An excellent excuse, but it won't do," he said. "There's a precedent for this, you know. A very good one in the Arabian Nights, so, forward, Scheherazade." Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow. "Meaning me?" she asked, voice wavering with uncertainty. "But I don't have any stories to tell. I've never been surrounded by bloodshed or mystery." "I don't insist on blood," Sir Henry interjected, "but I'm sure one of you 3 ladies must have a pet mystery. Come now, Miss Marple. Surely the curious coincidence of the charwoman, or the mystery of the mothers' meeting. Don't disappoint me in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple, ever poised, shook her head. "Nothing that would interest you, Sir Henry. We have our little mysteries, of course. There was that gill of picked shrimps that disappeared mysteriously, but that wouldn't interest you. It turned out to be something trivial, though it did shed light on human nature." "You have taught me to dote on human nature," Sir Henry said solemnly. Colonel Bantry, eager to move the conversation along, leaned in. "What about you, Miss Hellyer?" he asked. "I'm sure you must have had some interesting experiences." "Yes, indeed, Doctor," Lloyd added. Jane hesitated, a delicate frown knitting her brows. "Me?" she said, her voice unsure. "You want me to tell you something that happened to me?" "Or to one of your friends," Sir Henry amended with a smile. Jane seemed lost in thought. "Oh, I don't think anything has ever happened to me. At least, not the kind of thing you mean. Flowers, of course, and a few strange messages, but that's just men, isn't it? I don't think—" She trailed off, her mind clearly somewhere else. Sir Henry, with an air of mock disappointment, sighed. "I see we shall have to revisit that epic of the shrimps," he said. "Now, Miss Marple, perhaps you could give us something more?" Miss Marple, ever the epitome of patience, turned to Sir Henry. "You're so fond of your jokes, Sir Henry," she said with a smile. "The shrimps are nonsense, but now that I think about it, I do remember one incident, a tragedy, if you will. Not exactly an incident, but something much more serious. A tragedy that, in a way, I was mixed up in. And for what I did, I have never had any regrets, no regrets at all. But it didn't happen in St. Mary Mead." The room went silent. Sir Henry, though disappointed, settled in with a look of eager expectation. "That disappoints me," he said, but I'll endeavor to bear it." I knew we wouldn't be let down. Miss Marple, slightly flushed but determined, continued. "I hope I shall be able to tell it properly," she said, voice tinged with nervousness. "I'm prone to rambling. One can wander off without even realizing it. It's hard to remember every fact in its proper order. Please bear with me if I tell my story badly. It happened a long time ago." She paused. "As I said, it wasn't connected to St. Mary Mead. It had to do with a hydro—" "Do you mean a seaplane?" Jane asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Bantry, ever the expert on such matters, smiled kindly. "You wouldn't know, dear," she said before explaining. Colonel Bantry added his 2 cents. "Beastly places, absolutely beastly. You have to wake up early, drink vile water, and deal with all sorts of ill-natured gossip. Horrible." "Now, Arthur," Mrs. Bantry chided, "you know it did you a world of good." Colonel Bantry grumbled, but Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That's true," she said. "I've spent my fair share of time in such places. And while gossip is often frowned upon, there is some truth to it. You see, it's not just idle chatter. More often than not, it's based in fact." Sir Henry nodded thoughtfully. "The inspired guess," he murmured. "No," Miss Marple replied, shaking her head. "It's not just that. It's more about experience. You see, people who have a lot of time on their hands, often women, become experts at reading others. They may not realize it, but they become extremely adept at noticing things that others might miss." The conversation paused for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. "You see, young people today," Miss Marple continued, "they talk about everything. Things that would have been scandalous in my day. But they don't really understand the implications. They believe in the goodness of everyone. But sometimes that belief can be dangerous. I've seen it myself. I've seen things that seemed innocent on the surface but turned out to be anything but." And so, Miss Marple continued her tale, her voice steady and measured, revealing the dark and intricate layers of the mystery she had once witnessed. It was a story of betrayal, of clever deception, and of a tragedy that had unfolded in the most unexpected of places. A story that, though rooted in the past, held a timeless relevance, a reminder that the truth often hides in plain sight, and the most ordinary of moments can mask the most extraordinary of secrets. "Must have been an accident," Sir Henry mused, his voice filled with disbelief. "Of course it was an accident," Miss Marple replied with unwavering conviction. "Nothing could have looked more accidental. But Mr. Sanders had been in the merchant service, so he told me, and a man who can keep his balance on a tilting boat doesn't lose it on top of a tram. If an old woman like me can manage it, then don't tell me that he couldn't." She paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. "At any rate, we can take it that I made up my mind, Sir Henry," she added with a knowing smile. "Made it up right then and there." Sir Henry leaned forward, intrigued. "You were sure?" he asked. Miss Marple nodded. "I was sure enough. And another incident, crossing the street not long afterward, made me sure still. Now, I ask you, what could I do, Sir Henry? Here was a nice, contented, happy little married woman, shortly going to be murdered." Her voice grew softer, more reflective. "My dear lady, you take my breath away," Sir Henry exclaimed, clearly taken aback by her candidness. "That's because, like most people nowadays, you won't face facts. You prefer to think such a thing couldn't be. But it was so, and I knew it. But one is so sadly handicapped. I couldn't, for instance, go to the police. And to warn the young woman would have been useless. She was devoted to the man. I just made it my business to find out as much as I could about them. One has a lot of opportunities doing one's needlework round the fire. Mrs. Sanders, Gladys, her name was only too willing to talk. It seems they hadn't been married very long. Her husband had some property coming to him, but for the moment they were very badly off. In fact, they were living on her little income. One has heard that tale before. Miss Marple's tone grew increasingly measured as she recalled the details. She bemoaned the fact that she couldn't touch the capital. It seems someone had had some sense somewhere. But the money was hers to will away, and she and her husband had made wills in favor of each other directly after their marriage. Very touching, if you ask me. Of course, when Jack's affairs came right, that was the burden all day long. And in the meantime, they were very hard up indeed. They actually had a room on the top floor, all among the servants, and so dangerous in case of fire. Though, as it happened, there was a fire escape just outside their window. I inquired carefully if there was a balcony. Dangerous things, balconies, you know, one push and— Miss Marple's voice trailed off for a moment, a hint of grimness in her tone. I made her promise not to go out on the balcony. I said I'd had a dream. That impressed her. One can do a lot with superstition sometimes. She was a fair girl, rather washed-out complexion, and an untidy roll of hair on her neck. Very credulous. She repeated what I had said to her husband, and I noticed him looking at me in a curious way once or twice. He wasn't credulous, and he knew I'd been on that tram. Miss Marple's expression darkened as she continued. But I was very worried, terribly worried, because I couldn't see how to circumvent him. I could prevent anything happening at the hydro just by saying a few words to show him I suspected, but that only meant he'd put off his plan till later. No, I began to believe the only policy was a bold one. Somehow or other to lay a trap for him. If I could induce him to attempt her life in a way of my own choosing, well, then he would be unmasked, and she would be forced to face the truth, however much of a shock it was to her. Sir Henry, his curiosity piqued, leaned forward again. "What conceivable plan could you adopt?" he asked, utterly intrigued. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "I'd have found one, never fear," she said. "But the man was too clever for me. He didn't wait. He thought I might suspect, and so he struck before I could be sure. He knew I would suspect an accident, so he made it murder." A gasp rippled through the group. Miss Marple nodded grimly, her lips setting in a hard line. "I'm afraid I've put that rather abruptly. I must try to tell you exactly what occurred. I've always felt very bitterly about it. It seems to me that I ought somehow to have prevented it. But doubtless Providence knew best. I did what I could, at all events." A hush fell over the room, a sense of foreboding hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Miss Marple went on, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "There was what I can only describe as a curiously eerie feeling in the air. Something weighed on all of us, a feeling of misfortune. To begin with, there was George, the hall porter. He'd been there for years and knew everyone. Bronchitis and pneumonia, and passed away on the 4th day. Terribly sad. A real blow to everybody, and 4 days before Christmas, too. And then one of the housemaids, such a nice girl, died of a septic finger in 24 hours. Miss Marple's voice grew heavier with each word, as though the weight of the situation pressed down upon her. I was in the drawing-room with Miss Trollope and old Mrs. Carpenter, and Mrs. Carpenter was being positively ghoulish, relishing it all, you know. "Mark my words," she said. "This isn't the end. You know the saying? Never two without three. I've proved it true time and again. There'll be another death, not a doubt of it. And we shan't have long to wait, never two without three." As she said the last words, nodding her head and clicking her knitting needles, I just happened to look up, and there was Mr. Sanders standing in the doorway. Just for a minute he was off guard, and I saw the look on his face as plain as day. I shall believe till my dying day that it was that ghoulish Mrs. Carpenter's words that put the whole thing into his head. I saw his mind working. Miss Marple leaned forward as if to emphasize the gravity of what she was about to reveal. He came forward into the room, smiling in his usual genial way. "Any Christmas shopping I can do for you ladies?" he asked. "I'm going down to Keston presently." He stayed a minute or two, laughing and talking, and then went out. As I tell you, I was troubled, and I said straight away, "Where's Mrs. Sanders? Does anyone know?" Mrs. Trollope said she'd gone out to some friends of hers, the Mortimers, to play bridge, and that eased my mind for the moment. But I was still very worried and uncertain about what to do. Her voice trailed off for a moment, reflecting on the tension of the moment. About half an hour later, I went up to my room. I met Dr. Coles, my doctor, there, coming down the stairs as I was going up, and as I happened to want to consult him about my rheumatism, I took him into my room with me. He mentioned to me then, in confidence, he said, about the death of the poor girl, Mary. The manager didn't want the news to get about, so would I keep it to myself? Of course, I didn't tell him that we'd all been discussing nothing else for the last hour, ever since the poor girl breathed her last. These things are always known at once, and a man of his experience should know that well enough. But Dr. Coles always was a simple, unsuspicious fellow who believed what he wanted to believe, and that's just what alarmed me a minute later. He said, as he was leaving, that Sanders had asked him to have a look at his wife. It seemed she'd been seedy of late, indigestion, etc. Miss Marple's eyes hardened as she remembered the details. Now, that very self-same day, Gladys Sanders had said to me that she had a wonderful digestion and was thankful for it. You see, all my suspicions of that man came back 100-fold. He was preparing the way for what? Her voice lowered, darkening with realization. "Doctor?" Coles left before I could make up my mind whether to speak to him or not, though really, if I had spoken, I wouldn't have known what to say. As I came out of my room, the man himself, Sanders, came down the stairs from the floor above. He was dressed to go out, and he asked me again if he could do anything for me in the town. It was all I could do to be civil to the man. I went straight into the lounge and ordered tea. It was just on 5:30, I remember. Now, I'm very anxious to put clearly what happened next. I was still in the lounge at 6:45 when Mr. Sanders came in. There were 2 gentlemen with him, and all 3 of them were inclined to be a little on the lively side. Mr. Sanders left his 2 friends and came right over to where I was sitting with Miss Trollope. He explained that he wanted our advice about a Christmas present he was giving his wife. It was an evening bag. Miss Marple's voice grew more insistent as she continued, recounting the fateful events that led to the discovery of Mrs. Sanders's lifeless body. The tension in the room was palpable as the mystery of Sanders's motives and the tragic fate of his wife unraveled. Miss Marple paused, letting the silence settle as her audience eagerly awaited the next twist in the story. She glanced around the room, noting the curious faces, each trying to piece together the mystery in their own mind. With a faint smile, she began, her voice steady and filled with the weight of impending revelation. "You see, my dear friends, there was more to this story than met the eye. While everyone, including myself, was convinced of Mr. Sanders' involvement, there were aspects that simply didn't add up. The most puzzling of all was the locked hat cupboard. A seemingly trivial detail, you might think, but one that held the key to unraveling the entire mystery. As I sat there, considering the facts, it struck me that there was one person who had been consistently overlooked, the manager of the Hydro. You see, it was his actions, or rather his inactions, that led me down the path of discovery. You see, when he locked the door to the room, He did so without realizing that the true culprit had already been in and out of the room, long before any of us had even set foot inside. Now, the hat cupboard, as I mentioned, was locked, but within it there were no jewels, no signs of theft, only a pair of embroidered slippers, neatly folded pocket handkerchiefs, and a few personal items of little value. The real clue was in the way the cupboard had been locked. Not from the inside, but from the outside. This could only mean one thing. The murderer had locked it after they had taken what they needed and left, deliberately leaving it in a way that would mislead us all. A gasp echoed around the room. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide in disbelief. "That's when it hit me," Miss Marple continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The man who had been with Mrs. Sanders was not who he appeared to be. It wasn't Mr. Sanders who had struck the fatal blow, nor was it the two men with him who had an alibi. No, the real killer was someone who had been in the shadows all along. A man with a hidden agenda, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She paused again, her eyes scanning her audience. It was none other than Mr. Littleworth. A collective murmur filled the room, but Miss Marple held up a hand, silencing them. You see, Mrs. Sanders was no innocent victim in this tale. She had been having an affair, a secret one, with none other than Mr. Littleworth. They had been meeting in secret for months, and that day, Mrs. Sanders had been planning to leave her husband. She had arranged for a rendezvous that night, and she had been preparing to meet him when she was attacked. But why the fire escape? Sir Henry interrupted, his voice tinged with confusion. Ah, that's the key, isn't it? Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. You see, Mr. Littleworth had no intention of being seen by anyone, and he knew that the only way to enter without being noticed was through the fire escape. But there was something else. Mrs. Sanders had already begun to realize that her new lover had darker intentions. She had grown suspicious, but it was too late. The confrontation escalated, and in a fit of rage, Littleworth struck her down. The room was silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. So, what about the earrings? Mrs. Bantry asked, her voice shaking with the realization of how close they'd come to the truth. The earrings were a last-minute decision. Littleworth had been too hasty. He had taken what he thought was valuable, but in his rush, he forgot the earrings. When he realized his mistake, he returned to take them, but by then the room had been locked, and his alibi had been cemented. He knew that the only way to cover his tracks was to leave no sign of his presence, except, of course, for the hat cupboard, which he locked after he had gone. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, satisfied with the clarity of her deductions. And so, my friends, the case was solved. It wasn't Mr. Sanders who had committed the crime, nor was it a random burglar. It was a crime of passion, fueled by betrayal and secrecy. The unexpected had indeed happened, but in the end, the truth always finds a way to come to light. Miss Marple paused for a moment, her eyes glimmering with a quiet understanding that no one had quite anticipated. You see, she began softly, sometimes, in the midst of a mystery, it's not just the facts that tell the story, but the emotions we overlook in our rush to understand. People act in ways that defy logic, but when you know the heart of a person, you begin to see things with a clarity that others cannot. This, my dear, is the heart of the matter. She paused, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her teacup, as if contemplating the depth of the case she had so carefully unraveled. That poor girl, Gladys Sanders, her death was not just an accident or the result of a crime. It was the tragic culmination of her devotion to a man who had no heart to give, no care for the life she trusted him with. And yet, in the end, it was not the cold facts that brought him to justice, but the sheer weight of her tragic fate that made the truth impossible to ignore. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling in the air, thick with the reality of the heartache that had played out. Mrs. Bantry, ever the curious one, couldn't contain herself any longer. "But Miss Marple, how did you know? How did you see through all the false trails?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint smile, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom only time and experience can grant. "It's simple, my dear. Sometimes the answers don't lie in the obvious places, nor in the grandiose gestures of guilt. It's in the small details, the ones that don't quite add up. In this case, it was the hat. The small things that people overlook, like the ill-fitting hat or the sudden shift in behavior, tell the tale louder than any alibi could." She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a near whisper, as if sharing a secret with her audience. And then, there was the matter of the fire escape. The door left ajar. That was the key. That was the moment when I knew the truth. A clever man, but not clever enough to outsmart the smallest detail. The poor girl was meant to die, but in the end, it was her story, her trust, that led to the unraveling of the lies. Miss Marple sat back, the faintest hint of a sigh escaping her lips. The heart knows things that the mind cannot comprehend. It's often in the spaces between words, between actions, that the truth hides, waiting to be revealed. And, as for Mr. Sanders, he thought he could escape justice, but in the end, it was his own arrogance that did him in. There was a collective pause, as everyone in the room absorbed the enormity of what had been said. And then, slowly, they understood. It wasn't just the crime that mattered, but the lives intertwined with it. The tragic love, the betrayal, and the unspoken truths that had been buried beneath layers of deception. In the end, Miss Marple had been right, as always. Sometimes the most complex mysteries are solved not by logic, but by an understanding of the human heart.